Welcome to Elected, a podcast for women in and around Canadian politics and our allies. And I am your host, Sarah Elder-Chaminara, and I am very excited to welcome back for this a second time, Senator Kim Pate to the podcast. Hi, Senator Pate.
Oh, just call me Kim, and nice to see you, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today, and for everyone to hear this conversation, because I think it's one that is incredibly significant. And unfortunately, because of everything going on right now in the world, I think it's easy for major issues like this one to kind of get lost in the daily churn of world events. And this one is, I think, really important for Canadian society and for questions around citizenship and democracy and charter rights and freedoms. And so I want to get right into it. So you were a part of a 4-person delegation that just came back from northeastern Syria. So it was called a civil society delegation. You were there for 5 days. You met with Canadian men, women, and children being held in a detention camps and prisons for suspected ISIS members and their families. And the camps are run by the Kurdish-led Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. And tell me and tell everyone, what was the purpose of your trip?
Right. So the purpose of the trip was to go. We had been told by Canadian authorities that it was not possible to get in to see the men and the women and the children in the camps. That partly because it was dangerous, partly because we have no consular presence there anymore. Even though Canadian authorities, we were told, had been in as recently as July. And we were told that the RCMP was going in. And so one of the things that we felt very strongly, I was joined by Hadiat Nazimi, who's Kurdish, who escaped, came to Canada as a refugee, is now a human rights lawyer in Toronto. Scott Hetherington, who's a former ambassador and former head of security with the Global Affairs, and now retired, and Alex Neve, who's at the University of Ottawa, but also is the former Secretary General for Canada of Amnesty International. And we got together and talked about the fact that the position Canada had taken of not repatriating, even though Kurdish authorities have been asking countries to repatriate their foreign nationals, sometimes to repatriate because they're just trying to house them if they're women and children, sometimes because they're people who they feel need to be held accountable, and they're hoping countries will actually bring them to justice in their countries, bring charges forward of terrorism or whatever else they may have evidence about, or otherwise provide support for the Kurdish authorities to develop an international tribunal to engage in those kinds of trials themselves. It's important to put in context that Canada had been ordered by the federal court to return all of these Canadians, to repatriate all of them on appeal. That was overturned, but part of the argument the Canadian government used on appeal was that Canada does not have a responsibility to bring home Canadians who go voluntarily abroad and then run afoul of the system, whether it's immigration systems or criminal legal system, whatever. And as a principle, that's certainly true, but in a context where people are being held and the authorities are requesting that Canadians be returned, I think it's a very different situation, which is the situation that exists right now in the Autonomous Administration of North and Eastern Syria. And although that administration is not recognized as a separate country, they have been given support, including by the Canadian government and certainly internationally, for having been one of the few administrations that has managed to fight off ISIS and Daesh and have achieved some of the work on behalf of all of us internationally that they have, which is really trying to ensure that there is justice, there's peace, that that we're not seeing the rise of the kind of radical extremism that they've been trying to fight, and that we've all been saying that we want to defeat. And I say it, I choose those words carefully, because when I say we've all been saying, I'm not suggesting anybody saying that is disingenuous, but I think when you put that together with not taking the efforts then to ensure that happens, so providing military support, but then not providing humanitarian support for people to be fed and housed, not providing legal support for people to be called to account, not providing the kinds of supports that the Kurdish authorities have been seeking, I think then flies in the face of whether you're truly supporting the efforts they've made to fight off this. And one of the issues raised while we were in Syria, in north and east Syria, was the fact that the Kurdish authorities and the people of the area are extremely concerned that failure to address these issues, failure to alleviate the incredible pressures, including humanitarian concerns that exist within the camps and in the prisons, is actually breeding the very environments that could encourage more extremism, the complete opposite of what any of us want to see, including, I would say, the Canadian authorities. And so to be on the ground and hear that, to see that, to see the kind of desperation that not just the people in the camps are facing, but also the folks who are tasked with trying to to administer this, really brought home the urgency of Canada acting now. Not just to provide full consular support to the people who are there. And, we heard of health concerns from most of the people we met with, whether they were in the camps, detention camps, because of immigration, refugee issues, or in the prisons because of alleged criminal activity or terrorism activity. So there's immediate need for consular support, which Canada has an obligation to provide, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in the world. And we are calling on Canada to provide that. We're also calling on Canada to engage with the administration and the international community to repatriate people who can be repatriated back to Canada to be held accountable, but also to be reintegrated or integrated into Canada, including the issuance of temporary residence permits for those women who are the mothers of Canadian children, rather than encouraging them to send their children back to Canada to be presumably in the care of the state child welfare authorities. We know what that leads to. We have ample experience with what that leads to when you abandon whole groups of children to the child welfare authorities without familial community support. So we've called on Canada to issue temporary residence permits to those non-Canadian mothers and siblings so that they could be brought here in much the way we welcomed 25,000 Syrian folks just in the past decade as people were fleeing. We've also said, in collaboration with the international community and ANAS, to provide resources and technical assistance to provide the supports on the ground to address the humanitarian needs they're facing, to address the legal needs they're facing, and to build their capacity to carry out the kinds of trials that they want to, including the possibility of an international tribunal that meets international human rights standards to which Canada is signatory and has been in agreement. So we're talking about infrastructure like healthcare, education, food, water, the very basics for people, as well as these technical supports. And so that's what we came back saying. The Canadian government, in our humble opinion, has a responsibility to step up right away and to meet those needs. One of the things that really struck me as well was we went to one of the cemeteries where many of the folks who have fought ISIS are buried, and met with family members. And it was an incredible emotional time, because I was struck by the loss, the horrendous loss that these folks, these families and individuals had faced. Many, many members of their families died fighting ISIS. And yet the number one message they wanted us to have is not revenge, which many of us would have understood a call for action in a different way. What they were calling for is peace and justice, and saying, we need you to send the message back to your country that it's not okay to just leave everybody, all of us, abandoned, including them, to not have the infrastructure, to have health care, food, water for their own people, but also not to have it for Canadian people who are Canadian, or who have married Canadians, or who have had Canadian children, or who have Canadian children, and the responsibility really to step up. And they also recognize that there are many people within the camps and within the prisons who may have committed horrific acts of violence and terrorism. But they also recognize there are people who may be there who were participating either because it was they were under duress, or they were caught up in a moment at a time when some of them talked about people thinking they were part of the Arab Spring in a positive way, not intending to be part of something that was much more nefarious. And so the grace, the level of in-depth understanding, analysis, and awareness was really striking. And to have the reaction of our government be to not take action, to close our doors, to me was particularly distressing, because I think as a Canadian, as a member of the government, I feel a huge obligation now to keep bringing this message back. So I'm very, very grateful to you, Sarah, and to, of course, your Madam Premier, and so many of the media who are now bringing forth this, because Canada has thus far refused to send an official delegation. And just by comparison, another country was coming in as we were leaving, and after we left, we were advised that when they left, they took over 100 people with them. They were an official delegation representing their country, and it was Uzbekistan, and they took their foreign nationals with them, including some who may have had some of the same kinds of tenuous links that some of the folks we met with had. And so it struck me, a much smaller country, still dealing with its own challenges, and they've stepped up. And I think it's time for us as Canadians to step up as well, and not just be forced by courts to do so.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so many factors involved in such a complicated scenario. And I think it's worth noting that I'm not sure, at least based on what the reporting that I read, that 19 women and children have been repatriated back to Canada. But the government has refused to repatriate 4 men. And you met with 2 men while you were there, one of whom, the most maybe infamous, Jack Letts, who has the nickname or infamous nickname of Jihadi Jack. You met with him when you were in Syria. He's one of the people being refused consular assistance and being refused repatriation to Canada. His parents are very adamant in his innocence and in fighting for his repatriation. He was also he's actually never, from what the reporting that I've read, he's never actually lived in Canada. He grew up and was raised in Britain and had British citizenship. The British government stripped him of that, making him solely kind of a Canadian issue in that sense. But these issues aren't just ones seemingly of, as much as there's nothing straightforward about them, because a court may make a ruling, the government can challenge it. what happens outside of the courts is the politics of all of this and the appearance of being seen or accused by outside groups and even survivors and political people of making and threatening or fill in the blank kind of in terms of the danger that repatriating the men may pose to Canadian society, in their opinion. And that's something that the courts don't care about, is the politics of it, right? But that's obviously something that factors into the decision making behind the scenes in all of this. And so the sensitivity that brings to this is just an element of astronomical proportions. How do you, when you talk to people about this issue who aren't members of government, who simply see this as these Canadian citizens or people now linked to Canadian citizens made the choice to go, they participated in a group that committed ethnic cleansing, genocide, sexual slavery, rape, torture, acts of terrorism. When someone says to you, like, why should we bring them back? Why don't we just leave them there? What is your response to that?
Well, my response in what's happened, one, we don't know if each of these individuals was involved in those activities. Those are allegations. Those are the worst case scenario. We know that it was very clear to me, even just from the short visits and the meetings with folks, that how each person got there is as complex and varied as humanity is, quite frankly. And a young kid deciding to go, thinking they were being part of Arab Spring, getting caught up, being actually persecuted by ISIS first, tells me a whole different story than perhaps a version that may be out there. And I think we have an obligation, as the Kurdish people have said, to not just seek revenge, but to actually seek justice. If we want peace, if we want to address these issues, we at the very least need to understand how people got there. Someone doesn't go to an extremist position just, there's something that's behind that. There's something happening that we need to know about. What's happening here in Canada? We heard about what's happening in the camps, that ideas, ISIS recruiting is happening in the camps. That is horrifying to me, that we're not addressing whatever is happening there, and the lack of humanitarian support is actually potentially fueling those extremist ideas is hugely concerning to me. And so when I hear that, I say the same thing that I think myself. Yes, if someone has done something and we have evidence of that, bring that evidence forward, hold those people to account. And we spoke to was also very clear that they are quite comfortable and want to be held to account. People said, I may have made decisions that were that people don't understand. I'd like to have an opportunity to be held to account, to be able to explain what did happen, how it happened, when I was speaking, who was controlling my social media account in some cases, who was actually pushing for me to make comments, as well as when, what I did as an idealistic or a stupid kid, to be very blunt. And so, some have said, well, it'll be difficult to hold people to account if the record of what happened exists in another country. The reality is, though, FBI and my understanding is RCMP has been going into Syria, has been collecting evidence. We know very well that if there's a record, it can be produced. We don't want to, though, repeat the mistakes that we saw happen with Meher Arar, Abdul al-Malki, other men who were held with the presumption that they had done things, and then to find that in fact there was no evidence, or the evidence was fabricated. And that to me is a huge concern, that in a situation where we want to try and address these issues, sticking our heads in the sand and saying it's somebody else's problem, or leaving them in a with an administration that is asking for our assistance, and to ignore that request and to ignore the provision of that support is vitally important. It's not in any way to support if there were acts of terrorism, where there were acts of terrorism, to in any way countenance that. It is quite the opposite to say, how are we going to hold people to account if we actually don't bring them to trial, if we leave them in countries where there isn't the capacity to do that?
Well, and the application of justice in a Canadian context is not justice for some and not others.
That's right. We expect the rule of law to apply to all people. And the fact that individuals are being held. In fact, one of the Kurdish authorities said that one of the challenges they're having is they're not able even to bring charges with 30 judges for their People's Defense Court, which is what they refer to as, that's the name they have for their terrorism court. 30 judges and 4,000 to 5,000 foreign nationals still to be brought to justice. She said, by the time we ever get around to laying charges, some people may have served the length of time they would have been sentenced to, but they're in a context where we're not even addressing the issues that brought them here, if we're in fact trying to address justice issues and address these radical and extremist ideas in a way that will prevent them from proliferating in the future. And so that's really what struck me over and over and over again, is that we are ignoring the very people who are on the ground, who are seeing this, who are themselves raising the alarm. And you mentioned the British authorities had stripped Jack Letts of his citizenship. One of the first things this government did when it came into power was to reverse that those exact legislative provisions that had been brought in place here as well. And in fact, Jack had been to Canada many times. He certainly grew up in England, but with his Canadian family, he had been to Canada many times. And I, for one, I think it's one of the few things we can be proud of in this context, which is that we haven't made stateless people who have done things who we don't like, or we have allegations they've been involved in behavior. And instead, we instead are saying we should call them to account, we should hold them to account, and we should have a fair process, not one that is not well resourced and has no international human rights standards, no element of due process. And that's quite frankly what is happening right now there. And the Kurdish authorities is part of the reason they're saying, please come, repatriate. And we know that these folks have been questioned by FBI. If there are files, we're told there are files on everybody. If that's true, why not access those files and hold people to account here?
Yeah, it's, there's the accountability piece is obviously critical, I think, to this, especially in the eyes of Canadians who will say, why are we bringing these people back? And it's that I think the focus needs to be on the presentation of justice and the administration of it and due process, and that everyone needs to be held to the same laws and standards, even when it's really hard for us to, consider some of the things that these people have allegedly taken part in. And this is all, with a backdrop of, I thought it was interesting, and I'm hoping you can describe it, because in one of the reports from CBC, I saw that you had said that that these people are also being warehoused, quote, warehoused in inhumane conditions. And so if you can, Can you describe what the landscape is like there? And I don't mean, desert but what does the camp look like? What, what are the conditions that people are living in? Because I do think that matters. And it's likely that the camps and the prison and the system, because the state of the government and the autonomous region that it is, and the many issues that these regions still struggle with, is a lack of resources. And this is, to your point, fosters, potentially grows, as a recruiting tool for ISIS, because they'll be like, it would be very easy for someone affiliated with ISIS to say, like, like, you're living in this camp, these conditions are inhumane, I can join me, and this won't be your way of life anymore, right? So what did it look like? What did you see?
So while we were there, against the backdrop of the people of North and Eastern Syria facing their own instability, fearfulness about attacks coming, and frequent attacks and violence that we saw evidence of firsthand, we were there as a funeral was happening for a journalist and a driver who had been attacked by the Turkish military in a suspected ISIS cell. We also, as we left one community, it was being locked down for exactly the same reason. And so it was a constant, the constant threat of it was there. Then when you go into the camps, people living in tents in 40+ degree weather, inadequate water, inadequate food, children, and, despite humanitarian groups going in and trying to provide some of those, wholly inadequate, not able to provide sufficient. So it's also encouraging competition in those places in ways that also breeds that kind of extremism or abuse. And so we heard about people's tents being lit on fire if they didn't agree to be part of ISIS, or if they were seen to be challenging what was happening. We heard about children, who wanted to go to school, who aren't able to attend school. One of the mothers, the non-Canadian mothers who has Canadian children, who was injured in a fire, is unable to even carry her youngest child. Her eldest daughter has to care for that child, and also she's being taken care of. So the health, the fact that healthcare isn't available. We were told by some of the prison authorities that, they're responsible for guarding people who, less than 2 years ago, in January of 2022, there was an ISIS attack on one of the prisons. So 120 of their colleagues were killed, and yet they're still expected to continue to provide support and supervision of the prisoners there, never knowing when their own safety may be at risk. Prisoners themselves having no access, inadequate access to food. Everybody, was, there was clearly inadequate food. Clearly, nobody has access to counsel. Forget that. Its basic needs, at best, might be met. And it really, you see firsthand how that can breed the kind of instability, insecurity that gives rise to those who step in those moments to take advantage of it and to gain access, to garner support, to trade, whether it's food or water or, a cell phone, whatever, for some kind of security. And so it was very evident that things are just burbling under the surface or not, and exploding at times. And, at one point, we had to leave early from a camp because there was a need for the staff to be intervening in something that was, we don't know for sure what was happening, but to intervene. And so that kind of instability can't help but make things even worse. And so in that context, for Canada to say, to stand on a principle of these are people who we believe have done inappropriate things, and not even test that information, not even be in a position to check whether that information is accurate, but continue to leave those folks. And I think it's laudable that the Canadian government has brought home 19 people. We met with another 4 women, mothers, 3 of whom are non-Canadian mothers of Canadian children. There were 13 children that we know of. We met with 2 of the 9 men, the Canadian men that we understand are imprisoned. There may be more. Those are the ones we know about. And we think that it is our responsibility as a country that prides itself internationally on protecting human rights to demonstrate that on the ground, not to be seen to be sanctioning any inappropriate behavior, quite the opposite, to be saying we take so seriously our responsibility as international citizens, as people in the international community who put money forward to help fight. We put money forward for military effort. Where is the money now for the humanitarian effort and for the rebuilding efforts and for the accountability efforts? I think it's not one or the other. It's all of it together. So I don't see it as we just repatriate. Quite the opposite. I think we have a responsibility to also assist the authorities who are trying to do what they can, who are the first to admit they're violating human rights standards. They're violating the international agreements that they consider important to uphold because they just don't have the capacity to do it, and that they recognize legal standards, human rights standards are all being, essentially people are being warehoused because that's all they can do at this stage. And that's just not acceptable to be asked that by the very body that we applauded for fighting back ISIS, and then to say, you're on your own, essentially, by, if not, that's not the words we're saying, but that's effectively the actions we're taking by not doing whatever we can to assist in those efforts going forward.
Well, and also I think the focus on also publicizing, well, and it's not that this work isn't being done, but how do you prevent, at future times, Canadians leaving to go abroad or wherever it is, even not leaving, domestic terrorism, taking part in groups like ISIS abroad. How do we prevent the radicalization of youth here in Canada before they actually end up leaving? It's frustrating for me because I feel like we see so many of these threats, not only to Canadian society, but society globally. And it's the difficulty of these issues, the ugliness of them, the lack of will to tackle them. And then it just happens. And then we're on the defensive in terms of responding again, instead of being proactive in any way. That's my personal frustration with so many issues right now. But also with this, because people may think that the issue of ISIS is dealt with because we don't see it when we turn on the news anymore. That doesn't mean it's done, and that doesn't mean it can't happen in other places, or that it's not happening in other places. And these threats are real and they're significant, and they undermine the stability of Canadian democracy and society, as well as abroad in whatever country they may happen. It's just so fundamental that, to me, as a Canadian citizen, that the transparency, the light be shone on, the alleged wrongdoings of these people, and that they are held accountable fully. But I wanted to also, and I had mentioned this when I reached out to you to do the podcast today, was that I had the opportunity to meet with a Yazidi woman who survived the horrors of ISIS, Nadia Murad. She was in Calgary this summer as part of a fundraising effort for Refugee Health YYC. And she spoke very openly, eloquently. She moved, I would say, everyone in the audience. If you're not familiar, for anyone listening, with who she is, she was a victim of sexual violence, of rape, Her family was in the region of Sinjar. She was held captive by ISIS and managed to escape. She now lives in Germany, and she's since won half of half. You can, I guess it's kind of like pie, and sometimes a Nobel Peace Prize. So she's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, a Goodwill Ambassador with the UN. And she's also the author of a book called The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State. And at first, when I bought a copy of her book, actually, and I couldn't initially figure out why it was called The Last Girl. And it's in the context of she hopes that she would be the last girl to ever experience the horrors of what she experienced. And sadly, we know that she is not the last victim of sexual violence, but that's her life's mission now. And she mentioned briefly during her remarks or during a question and answer period that, that she is, engaged with the Canadian government on discussions of, what happens to former ISIS members or alleged former ISIS members, in their repatriation and, the quest for justice. But it's again, it's hard for me to sometimes be unbiased or impartial when it comes to, despite believing in the need for justice in the case of, anyone who was involved with ISIS, with the horrors of what Nadia shared with us and what anyone can read about in her book or by studying her online. It's just, the tragedy of it all is just immense in so many ways. Yeah. And I don't really know where I'm going with this right now, because it does make me upset to think about what I heard her share and what I've read online around Yazidis specifically. But the idea and around this around sexual violence against women is just such a horrific issue.
All right.
How do you, do you have those same moments where you feel where you're not pulled so much as, but moved to kind of, maybe go from, yes, I believe in the need for accountability and justice, but then also maybe the best word is revenge in some ways. How do you personally navigate that, having spent, your entire professional career, in the justice system, meeting people, dealing, with situations that are, so hard for us to comprehend in some situations. How do you personally navigate that?
Well, one, I don't call it a justice system. Our system I talk about as a legal system, a criminal legal system, because there isn't much just about it. And, when I first started doing this work, or the work that I did with people in and around the prison systems and the legal system, I started with young people, then with men, then with women. And one of the things that you've just mentioned, and I was reminded of when I was in Syria as well, is that women are often left to their weapon. They are victimized throughout. I mean, the fact that you have Madam Premier and this podcast is a testament to the fact that we still have not achieved the kind of substantive equality. And that's at the root of when, women are treated horrifically in any environment. And I don't mean in any way to homogenize it or minimize the issues when it's in wartime. But we know that's always been in wartime. We know. I was just meeting with the special rapporteur on slavery yesterday, and he was talking about in Japan. He's from Japan, and they comfort women, and the fact that we sanitize it by using words like comfort women instead of saying women who were raped. And I met with some of the family members. In fact, one of the women, her brother was part of the group that made the corridor that allowed the Yazidi to, some of the Yazidi, not all obviously, to escape during this back 11 years ago. And he's one of the ones who died in that struggle. And so it's, to me, whether it's the work that I've done here in Canada or it's meeting with folks in Syria, it's always clear revenge does not, punishing other people to show that what they've done is wrong rarely achieves its objective. We've learned that from how we raised our children. We know that punishment creates aversion, helps kids learn to escape that punishment, but doesn't necessarily teach them. We know that from our imprisonment, and I think it's exactly the same sort of thing. I mean, I know that if something, well, when things have happened to my children or they've happened to people close to me, the initial impulse is to strike back. For me, I'm in awe of the people who that's not their initial impulse. And that's what I was in awe of many of the Kurdish people I met with, is their initial impulse is grief, but not then followed by revenge, but followed by this underscores why we need peace, why we need to address these issues. How is it these people who started as innocent children became so disaffected that they could commit horrendous crimes? And wanting to understand that, not to appease or to excuse behavior, but so that we could stop it growing in the next generations or in the current generations. And that's really where I've learned tremendously from folks over the years here. Many of amazing women that I've had the privilege to walk and work with, especially some of the Indigenous women. When I met with the mothers, the Kurdish moms, during those 5 days, that really that inspires us to think bigger and better, and to recognize that if we really want to end these kinds of the thinking that gives rise to force begetting force, then we have to think differently. And I actually think it's women who are leading that. It's women who are challenging us to not just go for revenge, but to actually determine that we develop processes that are fair, that help us understand how do people get to that point, not to excuse the behavior, but to understand it and try and prevent it in the future. And that's really where I put hope, is that if we hold people to account, but also take those opportunities to try and truly understand how did they get there? How did you get to a place where you could commit a horrendous act? And in my working life here, that's really what has helped me most, to think about new ways to intervene, to prevent more people from being victimized, from being marginalized, from being ultimately criminalized and incarcerated, as well as not to excuse their behavior, but actually to figure out ways to intervene so that that behavior doesn't develop in the first place.
It's tricky, isn't it? Sometimes it's very complicated. I'll share with you I've tried looking up the exact origins of it, but it's been modified. I was actually traveling a long time ago in Thailand, and I saw this vintage thrift store, and they had a shirt that said, "Justice is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of peace." And that really has stayed with me my entire life since seeing that, because it reframes for me that, we will unfortunately, whatever, and you can define conflict in different ways. It's not that we may ever be without it, but the presence of justice, of peace with the conflict present, at some point, I don't understand why it hasn't stopped yet, but I wish it would. I wish all of the conflict would stop. I wish that, we were having a different conversation around a world that didn't exist with the term comfort women, with, sexual slavery, with sexual violence. If I had a wand, it would be eliminated.
Well, and in Canada ourselves, that we
didn't countenance essentially the mass disappearance and murder of Indigenous women, and the fact that it took until the uncovering of the graves for people to believe that children were in mass graves in this country. Those are all to me part of that humanity as well, that we demonize some and we dehumanize far too many, and it really is part of, if we're going to uphold the rule of law, international human rights standards, carefree, it starts at home as well. And so I see, I was asked to be part of the delegation. Would I have organized it all on my own? Probably not. Am I glad that I was asked to go? Yes, absolutely. It opened my eyes to things that once you can't unknow these things. And I think we have lots of ways that we can improve in this country, and this is just one of them.
I completely agree. It is hard because once it is, the unknowing. For example, personally, at the age of 15, I visited a concentration camp in Germany. That changed the course of my life. And, and it changes. I'm sure for some people you can go places and have moments, or I've visited Hiroshima, for example. Like, it's that opportunity, which I wish everyone had, to understand and to see the impacts of different things, right? Or because when you do, you don't make throwaway comments, right, around, things related to the pandemic and, oppressive regimes and what freedom means, and, the things that we take for granted, and appreciating, how lucky we are to live in this country. That being said, acknowledging, the grave injustices that still occur on a daily basis. For example, the government of Manitoba's inability and refusal to search the landfill for the bodies of Indigenous women.
Absolutely.
Right? So it's all very hard to reconcile sometimes. But, I think we have to keep our eyes open. We have to keep, even when it's really difficult, to think about, what we're hoping to achieve in the world and what we want it to be, not just today, but, for future generations. And we use throwaway lines like that, especially in politics, around, better for my children, low taxes, build this, build that. But there are deeper issues that really kind of, to me, are the framework of the society in which we live, that are the fundamental building blocks. And, justice is absolutely one of them in my mind. So I thank you for going on the delegation and, experiencing things that you will probably live with for the rest of your life, in addition to your incredible career and dedication to your work prior to joining the Senate in the field of in these areas. What if you could leave one thought that maybe would challenge the way that people think about this issue or the justice system in general, what would it be?
Well, I don't know that it's one thought, but I always think, if it was your child, what would you want to have happen? And all of us have done things that we're not proud of. I often say that when I'm teaching, I often say to students, think about the worst moments of your life and the worst things you've done in your life. Put them in a file. If that's how you met people, how would you be regarded? But is that what you would describe defines you? And then think, how did you come out of that? What did you learn? What have you done to make it better? To ensure you don't repeat those mistakes going forward, or create those harms again. And mostly to think about the humanity, the human component of it. Is we all make mistakes. Sometimes we get away with them, sometimes we don't, and that we are not necessarily the worst or the best thing we've ever done. And how we treat other people is more a testament to our character than any accolades or challenges. And so I really do think, nothing, I hope that nothing I ever say sounds like I'm in any way supporting anybody being treated horribly or harmed, whether it's in the present, the future, or in the past. But I do know that the ways that we correct or prevent those behaviors is by trying to understand them and address whatever gave rise to them, not by condemning alone. But that doesn't mean that condemnation isn't part of the response at times, and that may be part of what needs to happen here. That I don't know. I mean, I am struck by the fact that none of the people we met with had met, to their knowledge, a Canadian in person until we were there, since they've been in the encampments or in the prisons. And that to me is unconscionable. And, if Canadians have gone and not identified themselves, that's a whole nother issue. But the fact that all have been interviewed by folks and the FBI has been collecting data tells me that there has to be ways to hold people to account and test that information. And I think we all have a duty, but we also expect this to be done in our name, so that if people have done things for which they need to be held accountable, then let's deal with it. Let's not continue to throw them away and say we're just going to close our ears and eyes and minds to this and hope that it goes away, because it's not going away. The situation that is unfolding out there and the unrest that is still unfolding in that part of the world should scare us all.
Well, and also, I mean, it makes me think that ignorance begets ignorance, right? So the ignorance of, or intentional ignorance of wanting to just, pretend that this wasn't an issue, wasn't a problem, that we didn't have to deal with it. That can all be true. But that doesn't make the issue go away. It just, again, it's, we always say never again, but we are so good at doing it again and again and again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I've had people come into Madam Premier and tell me that they loved listening to our last podcast. And someone actually said that they used it in a research paper.
Oh,
yeah.
That's amazing.
I know, right? So, you're doing incredible work, and you're an unrelenting advocate for, so many. So thank you for giving me some of your time and for everyone who listened today.
No, thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the incredible work you do, because it's bringing attention to these issues in a context where oftentimes people want to close their minds to it, and challenging all of us to think more broadly than just our own individual spheres is really, really important. And I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the work you do.
No, thank you so much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Take good care.
You too.